free trade area. We need to trade among each other, but trade in what? Trade in the routes of services. Therefore, we need to industrialize, transform, and so on and so forth. Now, the African Union has created or has worked with the regional economic communities in selecting a number of regional and transcontinental projects in the fields of energy, of transport, of ICT, and when I say transport, that's road, railways, air, and maritime. I wanted to highlight that since we are talking about trade, the cost of transport within the composition of our the cost of export on the continent, 70%. So transport accounts for 70% of the cost of export in Africa. It's 20% elsewhere. And every 1% increase in transport and telecommunication infrastructure on the continent translates into 3% increase in exports. That's why it's important we work on our infrastructure, especially that the infrastructure that we were left off with mainly goes from Africa to the former colonials, but not between African countries. So that's why our program focusing on linking and physically linking the continent together and integrating it.
Which is what the president
exactly,
does.
And taking it further. We finished a 10-year program, and by which, you know, thousands of kilometers have been extended. And you're talking about the Cape to Cairo, and not only by road, but also fiber optics. And it's actually done by a Southern African company that is, you know, working on the Cape to Cairo linkage. ICT linkage. So back to the question. We will see the impact in terms of GDP, and we are already seeing, you know, an improved GDP on the continent. Many of our economies, we have at least.
In West Africa.
Actually, even in West Africa, we have 5 or 6 countries now that account among the fastest growing economies in the world. By all accounts, and despite all the challenges we're having on the continent, as a continent, we're still having positive growth rates, and this has been sustained for almost 20 years now. And resilience, not only the growth rate, but the resilience, despite the global shocks that the continent has been witnessing, we have overcome these shocks, and we still continue to have these positive GDPs. However, the challenge is the large number of jobs that are needed on the continent, and the cost of infrastructure is big, is huge. We're talking about the financial needs between 100 and 130 billion by some estimates, and we can only provide a third, maximum half of that as governments with all the competing demands our governments are having. And in addition to all of this, we are also facing a huge challenge of climate. And many of our infrastructure gets wiped away at the next storm, and we've seen this happening, especially in this part of the world, I mean in Southern Africa, and the shocks due to climate are happening in a much more vicious way and more frequently than before. And Africa, which is the less guilty when it comes to climate change, is paying the heaviest price.
Madame Stoffel-Delpret, Deloitte estimates that over the next 10 years, the Africa infrastructure backlog will need to be funded by the tune of about 93 billion per annum. Talk to us about funding.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I come from a landlocked country as well. We know a thing or two about needing infrastructure to have access to markets and to have a growth perspective. But I also come from a country where we currently live with negative interest rates. If you as a company take out money from a bank, they pay you to take their money. On the other hand, if you as an individual want to save your money and bring it to the bank, you have to pay the bank to take the money. So the huge amounts you just cited that are needed in infrastructure, not just on this continent, but globally, to also achieve the development goals that we have all set for ourselves. We need to find a solution, not just to the financing, but we also need to find a solution to having the huge amounts of money that are available, to bring them to the projects that need that financing. And we, as a financial market that is one of the largest in the world, and Switzerland is known for having the largest cross-border wealth management sector within its borders, we are very interested in exactly addressing the interface between the money that is there and the need that is so apparent all over the world. And we try to do this I would say at least in two paths that overlap. One is we want to look at the interface and bring our expertise to the table in helping assess risks, credit risks, debt sustainability, for example. Our huge insurance industry has a great part to play in that role. But we're also looking at questions of transparency and, of course, integrity of financial markets. They all need to play a role, and they all need to be brought together by the partners in a bankable project. And we're very much interested in finding maybe prototypes and working also with regional development banks in finding exactly the right recipe of all the needs, as also Mr. President addressed them, to have money flow from where it is to where it is needed, also to the benefit of those who then invest. And I would say the second aspect that we're looking at is the huge chances and the opportunities that are opened, especially in the West already, by the new digital technologies. Switzerland has a regulatory framework that already addresses the challenges of the blockchain technology, and we see how market infrastructure, financial market infrastructures, trading platforms, investment opportunities, advising of customers with regards to investments is already done on platforms, on systems that are easy to handle, that are very accessible, that have a great degree of transparency and stability and security, and we would already want to bring that dimension also into the mix of helping such projects come to fruition.
Listening to you, one gets the sense of an exciting future for infrastructure, because traditionally on our continent, infrastructure spending has been funded off the balance sheet of our states. And this is set to change now that there are new technologies and new opportunities for cooperation across continents. And that's one of the beauties of this panel, is that it's a multi-continental exercise. Jeff White, what is your contribution to this?
So I think, as a private and sector investor, and Agility is one of the world's largest logistics companies operating globally. And from an Africa perspective, I think we are hugely bullish on the African opportunity. A lot of our traditional markets we're seeing are slowing down, are stagnating. We think Africa is the place to be investing and putting real capital into providing infrastructure solutions. Now, as a private company, we can't do full infrastructure packages and sort everything. So we're investing in what we see is fundamentally infrastructure aligned with the growth opportunity. So we're building across the continent a network of international standard warehouse parks. Now, on the face of it, that doesn't seem particularly exciting, but the reality is the capability, the warehousing and buildings that are fundamental building blocks to economic growth and prosperity. So we use our warehouses, we invest, we put the capital in, we buy 500,000 square meters. That's about 100 football pitches, to put it into perspective, on the edge of all the major cities in Africa. We build the infrastructure and we invest in it, so it creates a platform that enables trade. And we see it, and I think it aligns with everything everybody said, we see it as a way that manufacturers are able to have an ease of doing business and manufacture locally to meet demand. It's a logistics platform that will support regional trade and the growth with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, the growth of a market that's 1.3 billion, 2 billion people by the time it's actually up and operational. We think that e-commerce is going to be huge in Africa. So although building warehousing doesn't seem hugely important, the reality is it enables SMEs to grow and develop. An SME can come to us, and we've got examples in our current portfolio where they couldn't raise the money to build premises to expand their operations and meet international standards. For us, they can come in under our SME program, sign a lease, pay a deposit, and get the keys and move in Monday. Likewise, when I look at our 65,000 global customers that we do integrated logistics for, they all want to go to Africa. They all understand the opportunity. They just find it really difficult to execute. So by building an infrastructure capability, a warehouse park, and it's landscaped and it's got consistent power, it's safe and it's secure, it enables companies to say, great, let's go into the Africa marketplace, and it makes the ease of doing business more efficient and much simpler and faster. If I look at Ghana as an example, one of our large blue chip customers, they had an original plan to go into Ghana that they thought would cost them $5 million investment to find a site, build a factory, set it up, start operating, and they thought it would be $5 million and 3 years before they sold any product. Because we'd already built and invested in infrastructure, they were able to come into one of our warehouses, set up their manufacturing plant, so their cost of going into the African market moved from $5 million to $1 million for exactly the same business plan. And instead of selling products in 3 years' time, they were able to start selling products in 3 months. So that's a real enabler, and going back to your point, that's a platform that can create jobs for local companies, can create jobs for multinationals coming into the continent. And I think, although we're doing it in a very niche sector, which is in relation to warehousing, the opportunity is, as infrastructure gets better, you can trade regionally, you can manufacture and move goods. Instead of just selling in Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, you're able to sell across the whole of West Africa. And that's what's going to really stimulate the economic growth.
Well, thanks for that very granular view from the ground. Wong Ai, you come from a country that moved from being a third world country to a first world country at dizzying speed. And your infrastructure is breathtaking and enviable. What lessons would you like to share?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this panel. And thank you for your kind words. I think it's easier for a country like Singapore, which is small, to get from point A to point B in 54 years. We just turned 54 last month. A little bit about myself and the organization I represent. I'm from Baker McKenzie. I'm the Asia Pacific Chair. We are a global law firm, and we believe in following our clients. And I have to say, Africa has become extremely interesting. You're seeing interest not just from the Europeans, the Middle East, but increasingly from many countries in the Asia Pacific region. Much has been said about Chinese investments. There have been Korean ones. The Japanese have been here for a long time, and India and Indonesia as well. So initially, as with all countries, you start on the infrastructure first. And that is the development finance funded initially, and then multilaterally through other countries in the region. If you can paint a story or convince with a story that regional integration and connectivity benefits all in the end, you will get a multilateral intra-regional effort. And I think Singapore has piggybacked on that through an organization called ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to have a louder voice on the global stage to get the funding and the attention that we needed. But infrastructure is just the beginning. And it's very interesting to hear from His Excellency and from Jeffrey and from Mina as well, the Commissioner, about, infrastructure being just the foundation stone, right? Because you're not really just looking at infrastructure per se. It's everything else that can build upon what infrastructure enables. Things like trade, not just exports, but intra-regional imports and trade as well, foreign direct investment, education, banking and finance, technology transfers. So I see Africa as being at the beginning of a very exciting story. And perhaps what I'd like to hear from this panel and maybe even the audience is much has been said about multilateral governmental and institutional effort, but there has been a lot of private sector investment into Africa as well, from all over the world, and they're all competing with each other. And the FDI is growing by double digits across the continent. So, it'd be interesting to see, apart from infrastructure, what the African Union and other countries are doing to get together to coordinate and enable their private sector investment. Because I think in the end, that is going to be the engine of growth.
I think they'll have to answer whether the African private sector is growing and is it growing as fast as it should. But Mr. President, we need to tell a harmonious story and we need to work on social cohesion. Events in South Africa recently don't bode well for regional cooperation. What can we do to enhance social cohesion and unity in our region? As Jan was able to tell one story, how can we?
My own belief is that as we aspire to modernize and remove our people from poverty level to middle income levels, we must address certain issues that are necessary to lift the lower strata of our societies, like in the area of housing, the area of clean water, the area of sanitation. These are basic and are local. I would believe that the 5 regions of our continent, in our desire to modernize and so on, we should not forget that it is necessary that we don't leave anybody behind by making sure we address those issues that are domestic, that are at national level. But of course, in the long run, they will relate to the entire region. When you have clean water, you would not want your neighbor to be behind. You need also your neighbor to make sure they address that issue. They focus on making sure the majority of our people have access to clean water, they have access to housing.
Mr. President, if your brother, Cyril Ramaphosa, my president, were to ask you how to deal with xenophobia in the interests of economic cooperation, what would you say, sir?
The issue is a question of understanding, a question of accepting each other. And that comes from how our current governments relate to the people, our political parties. We must preach unity, we must preach love, we must preach that we are one people. We are brothers and sisters. Not only in one single country, but in the region. We must talk about integration so that the mentality of this is mine and it ends there must be removed. We must move away from the past concept of communities being separate. Currently, we are integrated. You have South Africans marrying in Mozambique, Mozambicans marrying in Zimbabwe, Zimbabweans marrying in Botswana, people from Botswana marrying in Namibia, Zambia, and so on. We are getting integrated. So all what is necessary, those things that are happening are a result of failure to bring people to a level where they respect each other. And that can only be done when people have a hope, when people can see that they can progress, when there is a roadmap for progress, a roadmap for moving from the lowest standard. You can see that, okay, 2 years ago, I was at this level, now I'm that level. But if persons remain without hope, feeling depressed, it is easy for these things to happen. So it is my view that we should continuously have a conversation with our people, giving them hope for moving forward and implementing such projects, such programs in society, which lifts the hopes of our people to go forward.
I love it. Love is about growth as well.
Thank you.
Madam Commissioner, is Africa's private sector growing, and is it as buoyant and ready for the challenges of cooperating with the governments of this continent and other private sectors in the challenge of addressing our infrastructure backlogs?
Yes, but not enough. You will go across the continent, all of our countries, without exception, are conducting some form of reform in order to improve the investment climate, without exception. But a lot still needs to be done. And as I always say, I mean, I just mentioned the number of $130 billion needed for infrastructure alone. And of course, that's beyond any government to carry. So unless all stakeholders are partnering with the governments, we will not be able to address the challenge. The private sector increasingly in our countries is perceived as a viable partner. But as I said, it's not enough. We need to continue to improve in terms of ease of business, creating economies of scale to provide, you know, an attractive project, you know, for investment. Continue to improve our regulatory frameworks, not only at the national, but also at the regional, continental level, since we are talking about projects that very often, you know, would be cross-border, and that's a role that the African Union is doing. So harmonizing the regulatory frameworks and the policies and the strategies is an essential part of what we do. But there is also, I mean, all is not negative. We have African initiatives such as Africa 50, which is by definition a private sector initiative, or an initiative geared to attract the private sector, the African private sector, to invest in Africa. We want our brothers and sisters, owners of businesses in Africa, not to put their money in Switzerland, with all due respect, but to put them and to invest them in the continent. So we are looking also at attracting and securing the investments of our brothers and sisters, Africans, to continue working on the continent. And that said, we are also keen in attracting the foreign investment in order to, I mean, the private sector, the non-African private sector. This is also an opportunity for technology transfer, for improving skills, for creating, you know, new ideas. And it's a dynamics we need to continue working on.
It's at this point that we need to open up to the floor. But before we do, let's hear from you.
I would just wanted to echo the quest for openness. I live in a country where more than a quarter of its population is foreign, and capital markets need to be open. Growth is definitely due to the quantity or the relative volume of openness, be it capital, be it human resources, being other factors that are needed for production. And it is difficult. It is not easy. It puts every society in a very demanding position. We see that in Europe as well. And I would only like to echo the strong call for openness in all these respects.
Shall we have a broader discussion, please? Sir.
Thank you very much. Ishan Darura, The Washington Post. Thank you again for this panel. His Excellency, the President of Zimbabwe, spoke of the need to preach regional love and unity, to move beyond the politics of the past. But I would ask you, sir, what love and unity have you showed for recent protests of opposition in your own country? What can you tell us about your country's progress from the politics of the past, 2 years after a very significant transition, and hopefully towards a more progressive and inclusive democracy?
Mr. President?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. From the day I came to office, my mantra was that we must be united. We want a united Zimbabwe where everybody is accepted. We have preached peace and unity in Zimbabwe. We have opened up. For the last 20 years or so, Zimbabwe was isolated. It was a pariah state. That we have opened. We have said we are going to engage and re-engage. Engage with those countries that had not engaged with Zimbabwe before. Re-engage with Zimbabwe, with those countries that had disengaged with Zimbabwe. For the first time, my brother, if you, your memory can help you, the last general election we had in Zimbabwe was the first general election that we held where I opened global space for global media to witness our election, and it was very peaceful. We were surprised when, of course, at the end of voting on the second day that there was the violent demonstrations that have happened. We are against that. And I believe that as we go forward, for instance, during the campaign period, I proposed that all the 55 political parties participating in our general election should sign commitment to peaceful elections, and we did so, and it happened. But not everybody will catch up with good things. Some remain behind. But we will do our best, my brother, that we should continue to preach peace and ask everybody that only when we are stable and we are working together in unity can we prosper. And we will be respected by the international community if we show that we are democratic. We give democratic space to everybody. In terms of constitution, we have one of the constitutions, I think, in our region, which is very, very democratic, and we respect it. However, the rule of law must be obeyed. The rule of law must take root in our country. Not everybody observes that overnight. But as we go on, I have no doubt that as we move on, we shall continue to improve and deepen our democracy.
Thank you, sir. I saw a hand on this side. Is that hand still up? Yes, sir.
News, just in terms of interregional progress, how are you aligning with NEPAD, African Union? How's the coordination working?
Who is the director there?
I think to the Commissioner.
The NEPAD is part of the African Union. So the African Union is the Commission, the African Union Commission is the body, the political body, and in charge of policies and strategies. And our executing arm is NEPAD, which is now turned into AUDA, or African Development Agency. So we are one. And as such, we develop together, and the next meeting is going to be in November, by the way. We developed together this transcontinental regional infrastructure project, as I said, that has transport, energy, ICT, and tourism, by the way. And we get agreement over these, and this has been a bottom-up approach. So every region, every community, regional economic community, south, east, north. They come up with the list of projects, the priority projects. So, we come together in November. We consolidate all these lists and we agree on the priority for the priority projects for the next 10 years. And we take this in January to the Heads of State Summit to endorse it, and we go for it in terms of resources mobilization and working together. But that's only the physical part of it. Remember, the soft infrastructure is still a very big, important element, which is the harmonization part, which is how to work together, the improvement of the regulatory framework, and so on and so forth. And I still insist on the improvement of the investment climate. At the end of the day, be it public money or private money, you want to make sure that it's well spent and that it has, the returns we aspire.
Would anybody else like to make use of the 1 or 2 minutes remaining for this discussion? Yes, sir.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Wilford Mwanza. I'm part of the Global Shapers community. And my question is directed to Ms. Stoffel Delpret. And the African youth are considered a critical stakeholder in these conversations. Statistics say that about 75% of the population in Africa are youth below the age of 35. So this would mean that this would be an integral part where young people should play an active role. So which areas, or maybe how can young people be involved more in this conversation, specifically in what you said in bridging the gap between linking the capital, excess capital that is looking for places to be invested together with the areas where they can be invested in? How can youth be more involved, and what advice can you give to them?
Thank you very much for this question. I think I already touched upon a part of the answer I'm going to give you. It's your generation that are the tech savvy. You are the ones who have to carry the continent into the next revolution, the digital revolution. And you are our counterparts if we talk about blockchain technology and how we could use it for international money transfers, for remittances, for creating a stable coin or helping to create a stable coin that may help in stabilizing the system. So while having discussions here also in Cape Town, it occurred to me, and we discussed infrastructure, while you mentioned the IT side of it all. We are talking about roads and how to transport goods. This is an important aspect, but the next aspect of it all will be how Africa will be integrated in the global developments around the digitalization. And here you are definitely the most important counterpart for us as the young generation. So by the way, in Switzerland, we are all ancient in that regard, so we need to talk to you.
May I just add something, please, regarding you?
Second.
I did mention that when we talk about mega projects, they are great providers of jobs, and they help create jobs for youth. But I do not wish for this to be understood that this is the only way youth is going to be involved in any project, mega project or otherwise. Remember, our youth are also providing us, through the tech solutions that were just mentioned, with innovative ways of doing business, of doing these projects. And we have across the continent a wonderful number of initiatives that were initiated, thought of by youth, that provided us with ways of doing things that were not imaginable before. Think of the energy to pay as you go, for instance. Think of mobile money, which is about financial inclusion across the continent. This has been, ideas that, yes, you're right, people of my generation did not think of, because we continue to think in a much more conventional manner. But you are very much involved. You're doing a lot already, and this should not by any means be overlooked.
I'm thinking of the South African invention, Please Call Me, by a young man called Nkosana Makate. Mr. President, Your Excellency, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shukran. Siyabonga. And as we say in this part of the world, enkosi kakhulu.